And I'm very stoked in the last couple of years, just like the growth of where climbing's going, where healthcare is going, that I've had the opportunity to bring on some like really great clinicians that also work with climbers. And so I guess I'll popcorn to Christine. She is one of the first hires that we brought on to the Climb Clinic about a year and a half ago. And she's arguably one of the bigger reasons we've been able to like grow into the team that we're at today at the new Golden location. So Christine.
Hey guys, as Kevin said, I'm Christine. I've lived in Colorado for a little over a year and a half now. And Kevin kind of found me when I first moved here. Before that, I treated in a couple different states, but primarily treated athletes and climbers. I've been treating for about three and a half years now. But it's been super cool treating with Kevin and then growing our company into what it is now. And we'll give you guys hopefully a little tour of our clinic and show you what we're working with. But we have definitely some fun tools that have been great for treating climbers and now primarily more like outdoor athletes too. Cool, I'll throw it to Kerri.
Can't hear me. Hi, I'm Kerri. I've been in Colorado for a while, a little over 10 years. I've worked in general outpatient orthopedics for about 10 years as well in Colorado Springs. I recently joined the Climb Clinic back in May. So I'm learning a lot about finger injuries, about some of the more unique injuries to climbing. I've personally been a climber for 18 years, so I've been involved in the sport for a long time as well. And I'm part-time at the new clinic and part-time at our original clinic in G1 in Broomfield. So I'm super stoked to be able to combine my passion of climbing with my clinical skills. So I'm super stoked to be part of this team for sure. I guess I'll pass it off to Annie.
Hi, I'm Annie, and sorry, I'm actually homesick right now. So if I sound sick, that's why. But yeah, I also started at the Climb Clinic in May when Kerri started, and I've been at the Golden location this whole time. And I was actually a member of the climbing like student special interest group with Jared and Kevin back in like 2020. So I've kind of always been like connected in the community, and worked in like an outpatient sports centered place nearby in Golden, ever since I graduated, and like saw some climbers, but not as many as I wanted to see. So I've kind of started with them, and I've learned a lot from both the time like I spent with Jared in the class a long time ago, and then since I've joined the team here.
I'll also say it because Annie probably won't. She is also an ultra runner. And it's a big reason why we're starting to see quite a few more runners in our clinic as well. And a good mix of climbers who also do ultra trail running too. So now we have a really good clinical mix of kind of treating every body part with a broad range of different types of athletes as well.
Well, maybe let's check out the clinic. If, and everyone who's watching, if you're seeing like a bunch of squares right now, you can just hit the top right. There's 3 buttons and you could pin Christine's video. Maybe Christine, unmute yourself. I'll mute myself. And then hopefully everyone can see your video. Perfect. But yeah, maybe give us a tour. I'm excited to see it. I'm excited to check it out.
Yeah, totally. So this is one of our treatment rooms, one of our smaller treatment rooms, but we have primarily 3 treatment rooms right now. So this is what you'd see as you walk into the clinic. Let me know if it's out of screen at all. We have a main meeting room.
Slowly.
Sorry. All right, I'll slow down. Here's our main meeting room, another treatment room down there, our restrooms, and then our pride and joy is our climbing wall. So we have a kilter board and then a tension 2 board, and then we get some mood lighting too. So this is primarily where, most climbers we have that come in, we tend to get on the wall. So this has by far been the best rehab tool we have in our clinic. Otherwise, we have training equipment for sure. We have our strength and conditioning center over here, squat racks, benches, weights, bands, anything you could really want weight room wise. And then more recently, we installed some turf which I'm very proud of. I'll never install turf again, but it was quite a project and it ended up being really, really cool. So we have turf installed, and then a treadmill for gait analyses where we treat runners. And then we have a third squat rack in the back as well. I think we have equipment for a fourth hanging around somewhere. But this is a great space for doing like running drills, for sled pushes, some extra weights back here if we end up having like a climbing team come in for some strength training too. But yeah, that's kind of most of the clinic here.
I have some questions about the clinic, but when everyone's on here, does anyone else have any questions, like as they're seeing or looking around? As I know a lot of clinicians here, you're like, oh, I'm thinking about building out my clinic. Like, what should I do? What are these different aspects? Feel free, if you have questions, drop them in the chat. I'll start with one of my questions, and I'll go to a bunch that were in the document. But I guess my main thing is, obviously you use the wall a lot for climbers, and there's a bunch of questions that people submitted regarding that. So I want to get into that component. But aside from the wall, like, where do you spend your time mostly with climbers? Is there another area? Are there certain tools? Are there different regions? Are they mostly on treatment tables? Are they hanging from boards? Like, aside from the wall, where do you mostly spend the time with? And while Christine's answering this, feel free, anyone that has questions on the spot, drop those in. And if not, I'll get to the preset questions.
Sure. I mean, certainly I think as a clinic, and us 4 clinicians, even though we come from different treatment styles and we have varying degrees of experience, I think primarily we are fitness forward PTs. And so more often than not, we're getting them in the weight room. We're loading when possible. I think we're all pretty strong manual therapists. So we do absolutely have them on the table. We'll do manual therapy as needed. We're all dry needling certified. We all have a lot of experience with manual therapy techniques, but we're also all strength and conditioning specialists as well. And we are very up to date on the research on how loading probably by far has the most research behind it. We like to get climbers and runners and every athlete we see loading to some extent as a part of their rehab. And strength and conditioning actually ends up folding into rehab quite a bit. And so there is room for rehab and more downgraded neuromuscular control exercises, but you will see us loading quite a bit in our clinic.
So here's a couple questions like related to what you do in the clinic that came in. So one of them, there's a bunch related to on the wall. And obviously some clinicians have access to a wall, some don't. Since you do have access to a wall, how much training do you work on the walls that you have on any given session with a climber? And then the second question related to that is, what are your tips for assessment on the wall? So those are maybe like 2 separate like questions, but I think the first one is, how much training do you actually do? A climber comes in, how much time do you spend on the actual walls?
That's a good question. I'd say honestly, almost every climber we get in, if it's not a very acute finger injury, in which case we likely wouldn't be getting them on the wall first session, we get almost every climber on the wall. We actually didn't realize how valuable of a rehab tool these walls were going to end up being. And they've been phenomenal. And we're really lucky to have another one of our team members, Derek New, who is going to PT school next year, but he came in and he's also a strength and conditioning specialist with us, but he's kind of our on the wall expert. And so he has some experience with coaching. And so we utilize him quite a bit as kind of an extension of our therapy visits, whether that be like past the hour of treatment we have with them or within the hour, where at the end of a lot of sessions, sometimes throughout the whole session, we have somebody on the wall and we're utilizing the wall both to analyze form, we're utilizing the wall to just kind of see what their gripping positions look like. Are we seeing compensations? But sometimes it's just their first time on the wall since they've come back from a finger injury. So it's really just like, hey, we're touching the wall again. That's all the end of this session's about. But yeah, I know Kerri utilizes the wall quite a bit as well. So I'll let her talk a bit more about how we utilize it in here.
Yeah, Kerri, what do you do? What are your climbing assessments?
You're muted still, Kerri.
Sorry. So a couple days a week, I'm also at G1. And sometimes I'll even utilize like some other areas of the gym, like the hang boards and the campus board. Essentially just also trying to teach clients how to utilize things that are available to them in the gym that would be useful for transitioning back to climbing. But yeah, I'll often use, we also have a kilter board at G1. So I'll use that as an assessment tool. And then also just covering some different drills, depending on their injury. Like sometimes it's like, we need to work on, like, for example, like your shoulder adduction. So we're going to do some cross through moves. And just try and really make it relevant to what they need to work on. And some of that's tied also to the assessment of just like how they're moving on the wall.
I'm not sure if anybody's gotten to use the TB2 just yet, but we are lucky enough to have the mirrored tension board too. And it is a really cool tool for assessing side-to-side differences, whether it's in the rehab realm or just pulling out weaknesses. But it's kind of cool, kind of rehabbing from an injury, whether it be a shoulder, or finger, or hip, or an ankle, and just seeing like where some weaknesses are side to side by throwing up the route, kind of going up one side and then flipping it and seeing how they do going the opposite side too. So having that mirrored board's been really cool as well.
And do you guys utilize, is there any like video analysis that you build? And obviously with the running, you know, there's video analysis. I'm sure that with climbing, is there any video analysis or is it mostly the feel or sensation? And if there is video analysis, what do you use, or like what tools do you use?
Sure. I'd say like I will use it occasionally. Our colleague Derek, who primarily works with on the wall stuff with our patients, we'll use it regularly just to show kind of like, hey, here's what you did this time we did the route versus this time. I'll break it down and use it to show patients, especially if I'm noticing grip position stuff, if they're like gapping between their second and third digit, and I'm thinking that might be contributing to why they're dealing with stress in their PIP joint of the middle finger, something like that. I will kind of record them gripping with one hand versus the other and show them what I'm seeing gapping wise. And it kind of helps click for them a little bit better of like, oh, I didn't know this was happening. I'm going to focus on that a bit more when I'm going for the half crimp or the open hand position. I don't use any apps per se. Like I use some for running, but I don't do any like biomechanical apps for climbing specifically. I'm not even sure if there are any out there, but if anybody has or uses any, let us know.
Yeah, if anyone like also that's signing in, that's listening now, if you have any apps or things that you utilize too. There was another question that came in about specifically in your clinic, what are the most common injuries that you see? And I know this probably, maybe it varies per clinician, but tell us a little about the common injuries. Maybe also, we'll start with that. And then I have a couple other, as clinicians are signed on here that either have clinics of their own or are looking to build more of the cash-based model. I do have a, kind of couple of global questions related to that went in. But yeah, what common climbing injuries do you see?
I'll let Amy take this one because I feel like she's seen the whole array in the past couple months of what we've had come.
All right, that's true. So yeah, I mean, like primarily I would say we do see a lot of finger injuries. Just like a lot of, I mean, personally, like since I've started, I know Kevin and Kerri have been seeing like a ton of like the pulley injuries. I've been seeing a lot more of the just kind of like overuse, like more like chronic finger injuries that didn't really have like a mechanism. So those have been kind of fun to like work through with the patients. And then aside from that, I've been seeing a lot of like wrist injuries, a lot of like TFCC type stuff, a lot of just like shoulder issues, like nothing super specific, but a lot of just like, it hurts when I reach for like a really far away move kind of things. So like, honestly, I feel like I have been seeing like the whole array. Like I have a couple like post-op like ankle patients who fell and like fractured their calcaneus from the wall, or like hip issues from like high stepping and that kind of stuff. And also a lot of just like knee, like hamstring, heel hook type related injuries. So I feel like I've kind of been lucky just kind of like getting settled in here to see like a really like wide array of things. Like it's definitely like kind of starting with them. I thought like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have like fingers all day, every day, but it's really not the case. Like it's a lot, it's a lot different, which is cool. to just kind of apply like all my general orthopedic background, but just like make it a little bit more climbing specific.
For sure. Yeah, I'd say fingers are number one. I mean, pulley injuries tend to be number one, and then it's a lot of tenosynovitis, capsulitis, TFCCs are big, but we're seeing an uptick, especially Annie and myself, who were lower extremity specialists before we started treating climbers. We've seen a big uptick in acute ankle injuries, whether it be like bouldering traumas seem to be the number one, but like I've had some of the most elite climbers I've ever worked with mess up their ankles by walking down the street. So like we've seen some interesting acute lower extremity injuries as well. A lot of hip impingement recently, which I think it's a lot of our climbers who are runners who transition to running and kind of develop that as more of an overuse injury, but are noticing it with their climbing and their high steps too. We don't see as much spine. I will say I get a fair amount of spine, but we don't see as much spine as we do extremity stuff too. But yeah, I'd say fingers tend to always be number one.
Yeah. So how do you get good at treating fingers? Because obviously you go to, for example, we're all physiotherapists. You go to physiotherapy school. Like I teach a physiotherapy school, and we have like one day, you know, where we do like the hand, wrists, and fingers. So is it all through just like, you know, just through practice? Is the mentorship environment of having multiple clinicians, you know, around to ask questions to help? Like, how do you, I guess, get better and better at treating a body region that likely as physiotherapists, we don't see that often?
Yeah, I think like it's interesting because our company, all of our clinicians came from really different backgrounds. So Kerri and I had quite a few years of like orthopedic experience under our belt, and Annie had a few. And so like if you've been a clinician for a long time, even if you've treated ankles your whole career, you can kind of take some of that background and treating that, especially in climbers where like this isn't, you know, just hand therapy where you're only using putty and you're always at a table, right? Like you're loading the fingers the same way you're loading other body parts, right? So you can take a lot of those same concepts with your orthopedic background, and or if you're an outpatient clinician and treating other body parts that you would normally load, and transfer it to the fingers. But I will say I self-taught for a year or two, and then I joined with Kevin and just amplified my finger knowledge. So I think mentorship is huge. Like if you get an opportunity to go I was lucky enough to just work with Kevin and learn very quickly. I will say I was able to pick up fingers really quickly because I just took everything I used throughout my career and applied it to fingers, and that made that switch pretty easy. But like if I didn't have it, like I think self-taught is tougher to do for sure. And so, you know, if you ever get the opportunity to do coursework or to go to a course with, you know, folks like Kevin and Jared and people who are doing this every day, like it's invaluable. You'll learn so much quicker than trying to just, you know, read articles, because there just isn't a ton of research out, right? Like it's kind of tough to self-teach when there isn't a ton of literature on finger rehab specifically yet.
Well, then I'll pull it back to the source. Like, Kevin, like, how did you figure it out? Like, I'm sure there had to have been all this like trial and error, like the patients that you saw, like, you know, several years ago that you'd see now, you're like, what was I doing? But like, how did you then create your style, your, you know, your thought process through, you know, getting more comfortable with that body region?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I always joke because when I started the clinic, I opened it up in a climbing gym at G1, and I even was asking myself, like, yeah, I wonder if I'll see fingers. Like, I think people will come to see me for shoulders and wrist and stuff, and like immediately it was just like finger questions and how do I do this? It's a rupture. It's all of the shenanigans, and so I really had to kind of really dive deep in like what I had access to, which was for sure the internet. It was for sure like my orthopedic background. Thankfully, I've been at the time I had my OCS. I was in a fellowship program at the time, and so I was really leaning on a lot of that like evidence that is out there that might not be directly associated with the finger, but with like tissue healing timeframes and joint movement and like loading parameters. And so I really leaned on that stuff. Arguably quite a bit more than the actual climbing specific stuff. I think having that orthopedic background really plays a huge role. And I think that really was validated when I brought on like Christine, Andy, and Kerri. It seemed like it was a really nice fluid transition to kind of mentor them to some degree and kind of show them, here's the strategies of like loading and recovery and progressions, that it seemed like a lot of that clicked for them, which was really nice. And then really the big thing when I first got started was like reaching out to people like Jared. Like Jared has a lot of courses. He had the climbing SIG, which I was fortunate enough to be a part of, and now help kind of as like an associate kind of, I guess, is it associated professor, or I help out with that course a lot, which is great. And I think something that's so cool that's really happening now is that like climbing has really changed in the last 5 years, both as a sport and as a profession within the sport, being a healthcare provider within the climbing community. I think, I mean, this Zoom call is a good example of how many people are interested in like wanting to learn more. And so I think a lot of it was a lot of trial and error to some degree, but it was a lot of trial with using the best evidence that I had, the best evidence that was out there. And with the 3 pillars of like evidence that we really lean on as clinicians, something that I'm thankfully able to grow upon is that like our own clinical experience in our facility has really allowed us we have the sheer volume to see so many finger injuries and really hone in our initial evaluation, really hone in our own treatment styles. That's been kind of a huge component of our facility that we've been able to lean on as well too.
And then I'll kind of branch from that. You know, Tony, you dropped a question in the chat. And Tony, you can if you want, you can unmute and ask this, because I think this is a good one. I'll go ahead and mute myself, but go for it.
Well, thanks for having us, Jared, and your friends from Colorado. In Yosemite, we have some wonderful big wall climbers that are great at coaching, but trying to reach out to the community and understanding and allowing them to understand what we have to offer them, meaning the climbers of Yosemite and the athletes of Yosemite. More than 1,000 people come through there, you know, in a summer, but a lot of them are locals. To reach them, how are you guys doing at the Climb Clinic? How are you reaching your coaches and your extensions of who you are? I'm not a climber, but I've got 2 wonderful pillars beside me that are, you know, definitely big wall enthusiasts. How do you reach them? And so through the Climb Clinic, can you chime in on who your extensions are? You call them extensions versus coaches versus colleagues versus clinicians, right? What do
The
you call them?
network. Yeah. So kind of like how do you network out to the local community? I think Colorado is wild because I moved here from Minnesota and before that Washington, and the community from state to state is really interesting to see. And I feel like Colorado, just the climbers here live and breathe it, as I'm sure they do in the Valley, in Yosemite too. But I think the big thing is we make a lot of strong connections with local gyms. Tends to be the easiest because each gym tends to have a pocket of its own network, its own climbers. We of course see climbers who, you know, don't necessarily belong to a gym and they find us more often than we find them, and it tends to be social media was a big thing. I mean, that was huge. I think when Kevin first started the company, it was like, that's really the best way during the pandemic that we could, you know, reach the climbing community and give, you know, value as best we could. And then they kind of ended up contacting us and contacting Kevin when we were developing, or as injuries developed for them too. And so I feel like social media played a really big role, but we try to have a really strong presence in the community and not just in gyms. Like we work with local brands too. Colorado is a state where like Arc'teryx has its store here, La Sportiva has its store here. So we'll like partner with them and we'll do events and we'll go do community service with BCC, which is a company that does like trail maintenance and bolting projects and stuff too. And so we've found that what's cool about our company is we do have a little flexibility where we can do a lot of like giving back to the community and being in the community. And then also, you know, the community kind of comes to us. And that's what's really cool about having this facility now too, is like we have a space, we are now our own space that kind of can create its own community as well. But yeah, I think the 2 main ones have been just like getting out in the community and tabling and working with local gym owners and coaches at those gyms. We also work with a lot of guides and a lot of people guiding and coaching, mostly outdoor, but do have bases in the gyms too. And so we try to give back by doing like discounts for pillars in the community, and trying to both, hopefully they give us good word of mouth, but also like they're doing so much for the climbing community in Colorado. So we give back kind of where we can in those situations.
Thank you.
And where do most of your patients come from, I guess, is a good kind of question. Is it, yeah, I guess I'll just put there, where do the majority of your patients come from? Because that is related to, is it community involvement? Is it word of mouth? Is it, what is the process if that you get the majority of your patients currently?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it comes from mostly, I'd suppose, like, I think a lot find us. Some find us via social media, because we ask this on the intake forms of like, hey, how'd you hear about us, right? And so a lot of it is honestly word of mouth tends to be the most valuable thing by far. Like every new patient, it tends to be like either like, I've had a great experience with you guys, or I have a friend who referred me, or a coach who referred me, or a guide who referred me, which is always, we love to hear. We definitely, like, if we were to ask those patients where they go climb, there is like the bigger gym systems who also have way more climbers in them we tend to see patients from. But like for the most part, it's the word of mouth. I think if you give really good treatment and high quality care, like word ends up getting around, and it's kind of like a snowball effect.
And then these are questions, this one's directly someone submitted that builds off of that. Okay, so someone comes in, somehow they got in there, whether it's word of mouth from the community, whichever. What works best to get patient buy-in? So you're in a cash-based practice, I believe, right? So people are paying out of their pocket, for services. How do you make sure that they come the amount of sessions that is needed, to get them better? I don't know if anyone wants to speak to that.
Good question. I'll let Kerri or Annie talk to that first, just because they're more recently coming from kind of the insurance-based world.
Yeah, I would say like the biggest like value that I see in this setting versus insurance-based is just the follow-up. So we tend to like structure that initial evaluation to set up a program and a line of communication with the client so that they feel like they have a pretty good grasp on how to do their program and how to rehab their injury and connect with us for a good chunk of time, versus having to follow up multiple sessions per week and not really understanding what the point of some of their treatment is. So we really provide a lot of education, a lot of follow-up. And then, that just adds so much value. And so maybe they're only coming in for like 2 to 4 sessions, whereas in the insurance-based world, they might use like 12 for the same type of injury. So.
Yeah, for sure. I think, oh, go ahead, Kev.
I was gonna say, one thing I would add that has been unique to see over the course of the last like 4 years is that was something I was really nervous about when I first started the clinic, was like, gosh, like pay, that's like a lot of money, like to like pay just to see me. Am I worth it for like that 1 hour? But as I got more and more comfortable and like just recognized, like I'm a very passionate person as well too. I really care about climbing. I really care about like getting people better. And that played a huge role in also like allowing me to invest more time in understanding how to treat this like unique, like niche, like this unique, like climbing communities, like climbing specific injuries. And so over the course of the last couple of years, I started to also kind of gain my like clinical confidence, my confidence in like what I'm actually like providing. I was getting a better understanding of what other people were providing like in the area. And I think a big thing I really leaned on was really leaning on like providing something that there was a void in. Like there was a huge void in this, like, gosh, so there's really some great clinicians in like the Denver, Boulder like area, but there was some just like missing nuances of like, well, gosh, they treat the finger, but they don't like teach you how to like reload it on the climbing wall, or yeah, this is like a really good climbing coach, but he doesn't really work with like injuries. And so I was really just kind of trying to find my own path and like providing a service that people were really like interested in and like really willing to like invest in. And what was really cool is I kind of really relied on that strategy over the course of the last 4 years. And it's really naturally allowed us to kind of build this facility, and just understanding like I would argue almost every client that walks through the door, I'm most likely seeing them for their like finger, which is kind of wild. And I'm so grateful that like Christine, Andy, and Kerri here too, because we all see like a kind of a different spectrum, which is really cool that I wasn't expecting to. But what's awesome now with the facility and with the space and like with the opportunity to really show climbers like, hey, you know what, this is how we might load the finger on the hangboard, but rather than like guessing how it would feel in like a Gaston position, why don't we set the wall at 10 degrees and just kind of start easing into some of those positions or some of those movements. And over the course of time, it didn't turn into, gosh, I hope they come back. It turned into, gosh, when do I come back? When do I start like loading this? When do I start training this? Hey, it sounds like I need to kind of work on my hip mobility, because it seems like I'm just like really cranking on this hold, and I just need to figure out how to get my foot up higher. And so I tend to really start with clients, seeing them for finger injuries, but I get to oftentimes see them for 3, 4, 6 months. And all of a sudden we're talking about like what looks like a training plan and a lot less like a finger injury. And so that's what's really brought me like a lot of joy and excitement moving into this new space, is that like, yeah, there's so much more we could do beyond the finger, even though the client's perception might be, hey, I have this finger injury, how do I recover? But we also get to kind of understand like the root cause of maybe why they have that finger injury. And gosh, maybe it'd be pretty cool if we can improve their quality of life and their performance with climbing that also aligns with like injury prevention and injury reduction. And so I think that's been what's been really cool and really exciting, kind of with like having other clinicians to kind of lean on, where like I leaned on Christine earlier today with a client, because I was like, oh, this seems like a little bit, we did a great evaluation. I feel like I have a good understanding and grasp of what's going on, but hey, you know what? Christine has a really strong orthopedic background. Let me bring her in for 15, 20 minutes and have her do an assessment that looked eerily familiar to mine. And something that was really cool is then the patient was also like completely on board. Like, oh, wow, this is like, I just had like 2 high-level clinicians just kind of assess me. They both kind of came to the same conclusion. I'm really bought in now to this like rehab plan. And so it ends up not having to be a sales pitch. It ends up being like wow, we truly believe this is the best path forward for your rehab or your training. And this is how we kind of validate it.
Yeah.
All right. We have about 15 minutes left. And so I have a bunch of clinical questions that were also dropped in ahead of time. And I think just rapid fire. I'm going to just start firing clinical questions and just sound bites, pearls, whatever you have on top of mind. And anyone else that's here, feel free, if you want to give some thoughts to, go for it, or drop in questions in the chat. But I'm just going to start going for a few of these that are in here, and we'll see where this goes. How do you prevent hallux valgus, so the great toe going inwards, with youth climbers? Who's going for that one?
Annie's going for that one.
It's for sure Annie. She's our toe expert.
I have really liked treating the foot and ankle since before I showed up here. So that's my weird passion about PT. I think just like education is the most important, and like encouraging people not to be like walking across the gym in their climbing shoes, or like lifting weights in their climbing shoes, or warming up on the treadmill in their climbing shoes, like all of which I've seen happen in our gym. That's like the biggest thing. And then I like to train kind of like the strength of like the intrinsic muscles as well. So just kind of like encouraging people, like especially if they're like bouldering or belaying, like while you're standing there, you can like during your not climbing time, you can be kind of like working on those like weird foot muscles that go against like the binding kind of nature of climbing shoes. That's my quick answer, so I don't talk about it all day.
Awesome. All right, next one, moving on. And yeah, and also no climbing shoes in the restrooms, right? As they're going in. That's a good time. Drink a ton of water, so you have to go to the bathroom, and then you have to take your climbing shoes off. All right, the next one is favorite wrist stability exercises. And I actually saw a pretty rad Instagram post. I think Kerri may have put that up on a wrist stability exercise. But anyway, yeah, favorite wrist stability exercises. Someone go for it.
Kerri, that's you. Let's hear it.
I have a lot of them. It kind of depends on, if we're rehabbing like a TFCC or what, but I really just like, straightforward strengthening, like the wrist wrench, even just to build up the flexors and extensors, and then any kind of like rotational stability, pronation, supination. There's a bunch of different ways to do it. Really just a matter of like finding what works for the client and sticking with it, being consistent.
Awesome. And then here I think is wrist wrench. And then I thought this one was pretty rad. This was that looks hard. That looks like a challenge there.
I'm making it look hard.
It's hard. It is harder than it looks though.
All right, next clinical question. Oh man. All right. Go-to treatment for flexor pollicis longus tendinitis in a new climber. I'm not giving you easy questions.
That's actually a really good question. I feel like we have utilized some grip tools in our clinic for flexor pollicis. Great, got it. Sorry, I'm thinking of the thumb. But I would say like we've used a bunch of different injuries. We haven't posted any videos on this yet, but like we've done some like intrinsic strengthening of the great toe. I feel like what are some ones we've done? So like Kerri actually, I think, posted one on her independent page where it's like a calf raise on an elevated surface where like just the toes are on there rather than the whole forefoot. And I feel like that's a really good one where it's like you're still training the calf, but we're training it in a climbing specific way. But I feel like a lot of it is just also general strength training, and doing things like calf raises are a good way to do it. Spending times on the balls of the feet. That's the sort of stuff can be good.
All right, next one. Let's see. Oh, interesting. Lumbar chronic pain in climbing. Strategies for not stopping climbing.
Ooh, I'll jump on this one a little bit.
Yeah.
So the biggest thing I would focus on is I kind of understand the subjective a little bit more, meaning like kind of learning about their climbing history, learning what style of climbing they do. Do they love bouldering versus sport climbing versus trad climbing? Do they love slab routes versus overhang? Do they like climbing 5 days a week or once a month? And so that could really kind of help us better understand how they're loading their whole body, how they're loading the lumbar, the thoracic, the cervical, the extremities. Probably one of the more common things that we see when it comes to like low back pain is it oftentimes could be associated with a little bit of lack of mobility in the shoulders. So if you can't bring your arms like all the way up and overhead, a lot of times that motion has to come from somewhere. And especially if you're climbing in like an overhung route, it tends to come from like your spine or from a different movement. And so there's been a lot of climbers we've seen where I hear them through their kind of history, and they talked about how they might have even seen a traditional PT and they've been dry needling their lumbar. They've been doing strengthening exercises on the lumbar, but none of them really look at their like overhead mobility. And so what's been really cool now too is rather than just like telling them this voodoo of like, oh, it's in your shoulders, like your lumbar pain's from your shoulders, we actually get them on the climbing wall and we change the different angles, kind of work on some overhead motions. And we can actually even start to replicate like, oh, that's when I start to feel it in like my SI, or that's where I start to feel it in my lumbar. And as we kind of even do like a test retest, we kind of work on some shoulder mobility. We obviously look at the thoracic, and of course we still want to look at the lumbar and screen it. But that tends to be kind of the more common lumbar stuff that we've seen in the past, or at least seen where we can reduce symptoms pretty quickly relative to what they've been dealing with. And so that would be really interesting to see, is that subjective, and then kind of applying some of those like climbing specific principles that might have been missed in a traditional setting because of maybe lack of time or lack of knowledge of climbing, but something that I think is in everybody's wheelhouse who's a clinician here today.
All right, 3 last clinical questions. Inflamed Achilles tendon. What do you do with Therex, shoes. Like, what do you do? Inflamed Achilles. These questions came in. I'm not giving you easy ones. Like inflamed Achilles tendon. What do you do?
So that's, yeah, there you go. So that's assuming, yeah, there's the quip. That's assuming it's like an acute versus a chronic. We find that like most acutes also tend to be chronic tendinopathies, but short answer is get pain under control and load it as long as pain is under control with loading, right? You don't want to be an 8 out of 10 pain when you're loading the Achilles. That'd be just like calf raises, right? But if you can get pain under control, even with modalities, and then load it so pain's staying at a low to moderate level, like it's appropriate to load as much as you can.
And any hacks on footwear modification?
I'm not huge on footwear modification. I don't think there's great research behind like heel lifts. But I would say like it would depend on the cause.
Yeah, if it's climbing shoe related, sometimes we'll look at that if there's some kind of compression occurring in the shoe. I haven't personally recommended any modifications, but I've seen like anecdotally some climbers do some things to their shoes to offload like a Hageland's deformity or something.
Yeah, well, like in La Sport, like different shoes are made differently. Like La Sportiva tends to have a pretty aggressive like C cup around the heel, and so it can push on. And some people are built differently anatomically, right? So like not everybody's going to like that type of cut in that La Sportiva has in a lot of their shoes, and so they might need to try a different climbing shoe. But if it's not necessarily while climbing and it's happening with something else, like you could try changing the brand of the climbing shoe and seeing if that improves it, if it's more of like it's only when I'm wearing my climbing shoe.
What are your oh, sorry, go for it.
I was gonna say I had that long before I was a PT, and it was like in a very like acute tendonitis, and I cut an old pair of climbing shoes. I just cut the little like tight part of the heel off, and I climbed in those for a little while because it was only when I put my climbing shoe on. So I've not had to recommend that to anyone, but it did work.
There's some crazy Reddit forums with like people just going like all different ways to like slice and dice their shoes. All right, second to last question. What are your go-to hamstring strain exercises for climbers who have injured themselves during a heel hook? Injured themselves into a heel hook. I'll stop it at that. Go-to hamstring exercises from heel hook injuries. Any like tips, pearls? Sure.
I mean, if it's super acute, I still think like you got to respect tissue healing. It depends on the grade of the injury, but the sooner we can load it, the better. And it's more about what variation of which we do that. I think it's important to activate a healing muscle, but it's also really important not to overload it too. So big things are just starting with like gentle isometrics in a bridge position, like in a hook lying position, and eventually work your way to things like loaded RDLs. We have a really cool like toe down kind of calf hamstring exercise we like to do with a foam roller as like a stage 3 return to sports stuff, but keep it light at first and then progress load as able.
Yeah, I'm on the Instagram page right now. I love this one for late stage. Kevin, how easy is this one? Oh wait, you're not heel hooking. I thought you were heel hooking this one. Sorry, you're pushing down. Never mind.
No, there's definitely there's a ton of heel hook stuff that's like accessible like exercises on the Instagram page for sure. But I mean, what's so cool is that there's so many ways you can load it. I know that seems like kind of the general answer for all PT is like, oh, you got to load it. But I think the thing that we truly do that's maybe a little bit different, or maybe putting in a little bit more thought, is like just understanding that like the compliance at which the climber needs, like we want to build compliance for the person to actually load it. So if they're doing a supine bridge and it bothers the hamstring, like we know they're not going to be compliant with that exercise. And so it's not so much that we try to give them like 1,000 different exercises, but because we have this unique opportunity of having like an hour-long session where we can kind of understand like where their values are at, where they're excited for, like almost every client that we see, we ask them like, okay, what's the last couple of weeks have looked like? What are you excited for these upcoming weeks? Are you training for a trip? Are you staying put? Are you getting ready for fall season? And what's really cool is because we have a lot of experience in like a variety of different heel hook exercises, we oftentimes could really pick the 2 or 3 exercises that we believe they'll have the most success with. if they don't have access to like dumbbells and barbells, we'll show them how to do it with a crash pad and a band. And if they like, hey, I go to movement climbing gym every single day, then awesome. We actually know all the equipment that gym has. And so we'll develop a protocol that is like dialed into what you have accessibility to. And I think that's what also kind of gives that patient buy-in, which is so huge when it comes to recovery. Because if you don't have that, you could have the most amazing exercise that we spent all this time filming, but they won't do it, and that won't help the case, or they won't do it with the proper loading or strategy that we're really hoping for. And so loading is a lot of times the answer, but I think the biggest game that we play every day is like, how do we get the most buy-in into having them load it, and then load it consistently over the course of a couple weeks, even if they don't see us in a couple weeks. But that's where I think a lot of our outcomes really skyrocket here, is just the ability to kind of have the time and the opportunity to like educate and demonstrate why this heel hook exercise would be the best for them
sure.
specifically.
So I guess the final question, as we're kind of wrapping things up, we have some climbers that aren't clinicians here, and many clinicians who are climbers here. And so this will go really towards the clinicians who are climbers. And hopefully each of you has a different spin on this or a different idea. But if someone's listening, whether they want to see more climbers, whether they want to get better at treating climbers, or if they want to build a successful practice, right? Those are kind of like three kind of components. Pick one of them and give a tip, kind of your closing words or closing tip to either build a successful practice, see more climbers, or get better at seeing climbers.
I think the biggest thing is develop your tool belt. And that's like an easy thing to say without a lot of detail, but I feel like that some of that might be like getting more reps in, whether you're currently working in insurance based, or maybe you already started cash pay or got into cash pay, in which case like reps are harder to come by, right? But I think a lot of that is just continuing to educate yourself, like of course read the research, but like reach out to the experts, do continuing education courses, and then be in the community. I mean, show up to the gyms and climb and talk to people and meet people in the community and get yourself out there. And then, once you start treating people, the hope is that word of mouth kind of takes off.
I was going to say that as well. Well, part of that is just kind of like being involved in the community. Like it's been like easier for me to kind of like make this transition into like the climbing based PT world, because I've been a member at the gym 5 minutes down the street for the last 8 years. And like, I know the people at the front desk and the setters, and I know the people who are there. So it's a lot easier to be like, oh, like Annie has been climbing at the gym for 8 years and more, like she knows about climbers, and like I already kind of have a community of people there. So
yeah, I guess just to add to that, when I was in Colorado Springs, like also just being involved as a climber and getting to know people. And once they knew I was a PT, I started fielding a lot of questions. And then I also would do free assessments in one of the local gyms. They were super excited to just have me come in and be available to work with climbers. So that was pretty easy to set up and just become like more known in the community in general.
Yeah, I think I had the unique opportunity of starting the clinic in the pandemic. So I had no idea what tabling was. I had no idea about like traveling. Like I had no marketing experience by any means, but something I did really know was I wanted to work with individuals who like wanted to get better and like who were like excited to learn more about how they could like improve their like health and their performance. And this goes beyond just even climbers. I was excited to work in the climbing gym because I was under the assumption that like active individuals wanted to get better. And it's very true. And it just so happened that because I was in a climbing gym, I ironically started seeing a lot more climbers. So I didn't necessarily have this huge motive to be like, I only want to see rock climbers. The irony is the Climb Clinic was supposed to be more of like the journey, like the climb to get better. And so it turns out that like having the climb clinic in my name was really convenient for Googling. And as I started posting a lot of like accessible exercises that I think a lot of people were struggling with during the pandemic, as far as like, how do I stay active? How do I address these injuries? I quickly found myself like targeting, or a lot of climbers were starting to kind of like connect with me, and I was starting to see them remotely and starting to see them like at my like house and in my garage. To the extent where I was like, wow, I'm like really invested in this community. Like they really are seeking out my expertise, and like I consider them a part of my community now, because I was an avid rock climber, but not necessarily had the intent of being this like climbing specific person. But I'm very fortunate that this is where the cards were dealt, because like we said before, I think like I'm so excited and very proud that like word of mouth is kind of like our biggest marketing tool. The fact that like Annie and Kerri and Christine, they're all finding their like unique path of like word of mouth, which has been really exciting to see how the clinic is growing in that fashion, because it just means that we're really taking care of this community. We're not just trying to present ourselves in one way and then just kind of get someone in and out of the facility sort of thing, which is like a place that I used to work at. And I'm sure a lot of people have been in a situation where like the clinic value or the patient value wasn't as high as maybe they would have liked it. And that's something that we really strive for here at the clinic, is just really just leaning on patient value centered care. That's a long clinical pearl.
So I'm going to drop in. Thank you all for sharing that. I'm going to drop in. I'm sure all of you know the Climb Clinic webpage, the Instagram page as well. Like phenomenal content and really good clinic. I'm psyched to check it out in person in October. I wanted to thank all of you for coming, and then the whole panel, the Climb Clinic. Like a round of applause, for showing up and sharing your thoughts and your knowledge. It's pretty amazing how our sport is growing. And I think these meetings, we meet, quarterly, but this is a way to kind of check in and stay involved in our community, as clinicians as well.